A white cop shoots a black teenager with a Taser. After a while, he realizes he made a huge mistake. Subscribe and comment where you're watching this video from. The sun bore down heavily on the cracked pavement of Sycamore Street, a once thriving stretch of shops now marred by boarded windows and the faint smell of rot from overflowing garbage bins. The air was thick, heavy with the summer heat, amplifying the low hum of tension that seemed to permeate the neighborhood. Officer Jason Hunt rolled his squad car slowly through the street, his hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Jason was a man in his late 30s, his pale skin already pink from the relentless sun despite the air conditioning inside the car. His short-cropped blonde hair and chiseled jawline gave him a clean, almost pristine appearance, but his demeanor was far from inviting. His eyes, sharp and restless, moved like searchlights, probing the streets with a mix of suspicion and disdain. This part of town had always made Jason uneasy. He didn't say it out loud, but his unease stemmed from more than the crime statistics pinned up in the precinct's meeting room. He had grown up in a predominantly white suburb, far removed from the grittiness of urban life, and every call to Sycamore Street felt like stepping into enemy territory. As he cruised past a corner store, his gaze landed on a boy standing alone near the entrance. The kid was young, probably 13 or 14, wearing a faded t-shirt, jeans too short for his growing frame, and scuffed sneakers. A dark-skinned boy with tightly coiled hair and a too large backpack slung over one shoulder, he looked nervously from side to side, fiddling with the phone that he held in his hands. Jason slowed the car, narrowing his eyes. The boy's nervousness triggered a familiar instinct, a mix of suspicion and adrenaline that Jason had learned to trust. He parked the car a few yards away and stepped out, adjusting his utility belt as he approached. "Hey, kid!" Jason's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and authoritative. The boy flinched, looking up from his phone with wide eyes. "What are you doing here?" Jason asked, his hand resting lightly on the holster of his weapon. The boy glanced around, seemingly unsure if Jason was even addressing him. I'm waiting for my mom," the boy stammered, clutching his phone tightly. His voice was soft, almost apologetic, and Jason noticed the way his fingers trembled. "Waiting for your mom?" Jason repeated, the corners of his mouth twitching into a skeptical smirk. Why does that sound like the kind of thing someone would say to cover their tracks? The boy blinked, confusion flashing across his face. "I lost my keys," he said, holding up his phone as if that explained everything. "I called her, and she said she's coming to pick me up." Jason stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel-strewn sidewalk. "Lost your keys, huh? And what's in the bag?" The boy hesitated, his grip tightening on the strap of his backpack. "Just school stuff." Jason tilted his head, scrutinizing him. "School stuff? You sure about that? Because you fit the description of someone we're looking for." The boy's eyes widened. "What? I didn't do anything, I swear." Jason's smirk deepened into something colder, more calculated. "Funny. You know, you look a lot like the guy who hit that convenience store last week. Same height, same build, and I gotta say, that nervous act isn't helping your case." The boy shook his head frantically. "That wasn't me. I don't even—" "Hands out of your pockets," Jason barked, his voice rising. The boy froze, his chest heaving as he raised his trembling hands. A small crowd of bystanders began to gather at a distance, their murmurs barely audible over the pounding of the boy's heart. Jason could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't care. His focus was entirely on the boy, on the possibility that this could be the break he needed to make his shift worthwhile. "What's your name?" Jason demanded. "Zachary," the boy stammered. "Zachary what?" "Green. Zachary Green." Jason scoffed, his fingers flexing over his belt. "All right, Zachary Green. Let's see what you're really carrying in that bag." "No, it's just books, I swear," Zachary protested, stepping back. The movement was small, reflexive, but it was enough. Jason's instincts flared. "Don't you move," he shouted, his hand flying to the taser strapped to his side. The boy froze, his breath caught in his throat, but the moment had already tipped over into something irreversible. With a crackling burst of electricity, the taser's prongs shot forward, striking Zachary in the chest. The boy let out a strangled cry as his body convulsed and crumpled to the ground. His backpack fell open, spilling out textbooks, a pencil case, and a crushed bag of chips. The murmurs in the crowd turned into sharp cries of outrage. "What the hell are you doing?" someone shouted. Jason turned his head, scanning the onlookers with narrowed eyes. "Back up," he barked. "Everyone, back up! Police business!" But the crowd didn't disperse. Instead, more phones appeared, their lenses capturing every moment. Jason felt a prickle of unease at the sight of so many cameras, but he squared his shoulders, his face hardening into an impenetrable mask. Behind him, the boy lay motionless, his chest rising and falling shallowly. Jason turned back toward him, crouching down and placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Stay down," he muttered, more out of habit than concern. But his words were drowned out by the sound of hurried footsteps approaching. "Zachary!" a voice roared, filled with a mix of fury and terror. Jason looked up, his breath hitching as he saw Captain David Green, his superior, pushing through the crowd. The man's face was a mask of horror as he dropped to his knees beside the boy. "What the hell have you done?" David demanded, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. Jason opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The boy he had just tasered was his captain's son. The crowd surged closer, their murmurs turning into shouts that pierced the thick summer air. Captain David Green, still kneeling beside his son, barely heard them. His hands hovered over Zachary's chest, trembling as he checked for a pulse, his mind racing. Zachary's breathing was shallow, but it was there. Relief flickered briefly, but anger surged right behind it, white-hot and consuming. "Someone call an ambulance," David shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Jason Hunt, who stood frozen a few feet away, the taser still clutched in his hand. What the hell did you do to my son?" Jason opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The realization of what had just happened washed over him, pulling him under like a riptide. The boy wasn't just some random kid, he was Captain Green's son, his superior, his boss. David didn't wait for an answer. His hands moved quickly, checking Zachary's head for injuries. He spotted a small cut where Zachary's head had hit the pavement, blood trickling down in a thin line. The sight of it ignited a rage in David that he hadn't felt in years. He turned back to Jason, his voice sharp and commanding. "Get your damn taser out of my sight and step back." Jason hesitated, his instincts telling him to hold his ground, but David's glare cut through him like a blade. He holstered the taser, raising his hands slightly as if to signal compliance. "I thought—" "He was acting suspicious," Jason stammered, his voice shaky. "He fit the description of—" "You thought?" David's voice was low, dangerous. "You thought my son was a threat? He's a 13-year-old boy." Before Jason could respond, the crowd erupted again, their anger now focused on him. "You're a coward!" someone shouted. Another voice joined in. "That kid didn't do anything." Phones were still pointed at him, capturing every second. Jason's stomach churned. He could already see the headlines in his mind. Police officer tasers black teenager without cause. His hands clenched into fists, but he didn't dare move. Not with David glaring at him like that. The distant wail of an approaching ambulance cut through the noise, bringing a brief moment of silence. David turned his attention back to Zachary, brushing a hand over his son's forehead. "Stay with me, Zach," he whispered. "Help's on the way." The ambulance pulled up to the curb, its lights casting red and blue streaks across the crowd. 2 paramedics jumped out, pushing through the onlookers with their equipment. David stepped back just enough to let them work, but his eyes never left Jason. "This isn't over," David said, his voice barely more than a growl. Jason swallowed hard, nodding numbly. He didn't know what else to do. As the paramedics loaded Zachary onto a stretcher, David followed, climbing into the ambulance without another glance at Jason. The doors slammed shut, and the vehicle sped away, leaving Jason alone with the crowd and their judging eyes. Back at the precinct, David paced the hallway outside the hospital room where Zachary was being treated. His mind was a storm of emotions: anger, fear, guilt. He replayed the moment he had arrived on the scene, the sight of Zachary on the ground, the taser wires still attached to his chest. It was a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The door to the room opened, and a nurse stepped out. She gave David a small, reassuring smile. "He's stable," she said. "He has a mild concussion and some bruising, but he'll be okay." David nodded, his shoulders sagging in relief. "Thank you," he murmured. When he entered the room, Zachary was awake, though his eyes were heavy-lidded from the painkillers. He looked up at his father with a mix of fear and anger. "Dad?" Zachary's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I'm here, son," David said, sitting beside the bed. He reached for Zachary's hand, but the boy pulled away. "Why did he do it?" Zachary asked, his voice cracking. "I didn't do anything." David's throat tightened. How could he explain this to his son? How could he justify the actions of one of his own officers? "You didn't do anything wrong," he said finally. "This is on him." Zachary turned his head away, his lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not just him. It's all of you." The words hit David like a slap. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. Instead, he sat in silence, the weight of Zachary's accusation settling over him like a shroud. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, the video of the incident had already gone viral. Local news stations picked it up, running headlines like "Police Officer Tasers Unarmed Black Teen." Activists began organizing protests calling for accountability and justice. The footage was damning. Jason's aggressive demeanor, the unnecessary use of force, the sight of Zachary writhing on the ground. Jason sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen but unable to focus. His colleagues avoided his gaze, their whispers just loud enough for him to hear snippets. "Can you believe that guy? Captain Green's son, no less. He's done for. Good riddance." The phone on his desk rang, jolting him. He picked it up, his voice hollow. "Officer Hunt." "Jason." The voice on the other end was cold, professional. It was Chief Marlowe. "I need you in my office, now." Jason hung up without a word, his stomach churning as he stood. The walk to the chief's office felt like a death march. When he entered, Marlowe was sitting behind his desk, his expression grim. "Close the door," Marlowe said. Jason did as he was told, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Chief, Save it, Marlowe interrupted. He pushed a folder across the desk. Do you have any idea what kind of storm you've unleashed? That kid you tasered is not just anyone. He's Captain Green's son. And thanks to you, we've got protests forming outside the station and reporters breathing down our necks. Jason's jaw tightened. I thought he was a suspect. You thought wrong, Marlowe snapped. You should have known better. This department can't afford mistakes like this, especially not now. Jason swallowed hard. What happens next? Marlowe leaned back in his chair, his eyes cold. For now, you're on administrative leave pending an investigation. But I wouldn't hold my breath if I were you. By the time the protest started later that evening, the precinct was surrounded by a sea of people holding signs that read, Justice for Zachary Green and End Police Brutality. David watched the scene from the hospital window, his emotions a tangled mess. He knew he should be out there, addressing the crowd, showing solidarity, but he couldn't bring himself to leave Zachary's side. As the chants grew louder, Zachary turned to him, his voice quiet but steady. They're right, you know. It's not just him, it's the whole system. David didn't respond. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if he could defend the badge he had sworn to uphold. The precinct was different after the incident. A heavy tension hung in the air like an approaching storm. The station, normally a buzzing hive of activity, felt muted, as if everyone was waiting for something to break. Officers avoided eye contact, conversations halted when someone walked by, and whispers filled the silence that had replaced the usual hum of camaraderie. David Green sat at his desk, staring at a stack of papers that seemed to grow taller by the minute. Despite his best efforts to concentrate, his mind kept drifting back to Zachary, his son lying in the hospital bed, the way his eyes filled with a mix of confusion and betrayal. David could see the same scene replaying in his mind every time he blinked. The door to his office opened, and Lieutenant Ramirez stepped in. She paused, her face a mask of professional calm, but David could see the tension in her eyes. She cleared her throat before speaking. David, the Internal Affairs report came in, she said, handing him a folder. Her voice was clipped, the formality of it almost foreign to David. They had known each other for years, but the weight of what was happening had put a strain even on their friendship. David took the folder, his fingers tightening around it. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the words that blurred together. Use of excessive force, lack of probable cause, violation of protocol. Each phrase felt like another blow. Ramirez cleared her throat again, hesitating. There's also something else, David. The chief has asked for a meeting with you. He wants to discuss the ongoing situation. David nodded, though his stomach twisted at the thought. He knew what discussing the ongoing situation really meant. The department was under scrutiny, and it was his son's face on every news channel. The video had sparked protests across the city, and now everyone was looking to him for answers. Answers he wasn't sure he had. Thank you, Ramirez, he said, his voice tired. Tell the chief I'll be there. As Ramirez left, David leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The words from the report echoed in his mind. He had always believed in the system, believed that the badge he wore stood for something good, something just. But now that belief was crumbling. The system had failed his son, and he wasn't sure if he could ever put his faith in it again. David walked into the chief's office, the tension in the room almost palpable. Chief Marlowe sat behind his desk, his face a grim mask of frustration. He gestured for David to sit, but the captain remained standing, his posture rigid. David, we need to talk about what happened, Marlowe began, his voice low and serious. The situation is getting out of control. The protests are growing and the media won't let this go. We need to address this before it spirals even further. David's jaw tightened and he nodded. I know, Chief. I want justice for my son, but that means we have to be honest about what happened. Marlowe leaned back, his eyes narrowing. David, we're walking a very fine line here. I understand that you're hurting, but we have to consider the consequences for the department. We can't afford to look weak. We have to stand united. United? David's voice rose, his frustration boiling over. Jason Hunt tasered my 13-year-old son without cause. He needs to be held accountable. If we try to cover this up, we're only proving the protesters right. We're proving Zachary right. Marlowe sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. David, I understand your position, but Jason has supporters in the department. He's not just going to go quietly. If we push too hard, this could turn into a full-blown crisis. David clenched his teeth, the weight of his frustration and anger pressing down on him. He thought of Zachary in the hospital, his face pale against the white sheets. He thought of the fear in his son's eyes, the anger that simmered just below the surface. He had to do something. He had to make this right. I'm not going to let this slide, Chief, David said finally, his voice steady. If Jason has supporters, they're part of the problem. We need to address this, not bury it. Marlowe's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Be careful, David. You're walking a dangerous path. Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment. David didn't respond. He turned and walked out of the office, his heart pounding. He knew the risks, but he couldn't ignore what had happened to his son. He had spent his entire career serving the department, believing in the system. But now he realized that the system was only as good as the people who upheld it, and too many of those people were failing. Back at the hospital, Zachary's room was filled with a heavy silence. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his face expressionless. His mother, Letitia, sat beside him, her fingers brushing through his hair in a soothing gesture. You know, your dad is trying to make this right, Letitia said softly, her voice filled with both love and exhaustion. He's doing everything he can. Zachary didn't look at her. He swallowed, his throat tight. I know, Mom, but it doesn't change what happened. Letitia's heart broke at the resignation in her son's voice. She leaned down, pressing a kiss to his forehead. I know, baby, but we have to believe that things can get better. We can't give up. Zachary finally turned his head, meeting her eyes. There was a hardness there, something she hadn't seen before. It's not just about me, Mom. It's about all of us. Everyone who looks like me. This isn't going to change just because Dad says it should. Letitia nodded, tears pricking at her eyes. I know, sweetheart, but we have to start somewhere. David returned to the precinct, his mind heavy with the weight of everything that was happening. As he walked through the halls, he could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him. Some looked at him with sympathy, others with judgment. He could hear their whispers, the way they spoke about him as if he weren't even there. Green's lost it. He's letting this get too personal. Can't blame him, but he's putting us all at risk. David ignored them, his focus narrowing as he made his way to his office. When he opened the door, he found a small stack of files on his desk. Files he hadn't asked for. He picked up the first one, his eyes scanning the name on the cover. Jason Hunt. David opened the file, his eyes narrowing as he read. It was a record of complaints. Complaints filed against Jason by members of the community. Excessive force, verbal abuse, racial profiling. There were more than David could count, and yet each one was stamped with the same word: closed. David's heart pounded in his chest as he flipped through the pages. The complaints had been buried, each one swept under the rug by someone higher up. This was more than just one bad cop. This was a system that had protected him, enabled him, allowed him to continue hurting people without consequence. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This was his chance to make a difference, to expose the truth, no matter the cost. He knew that if he pursued this, it would put him in direct conflict with the department. It could cost him his career. But as he thought of Zachary, of the fear and pain in his son's eyes, David knew that he couldn't walk away. He picked up the phone on his desk, dialing Ramirez. When she answered, her voice was tense. "Lieutenant Ramirez." "Ramirez, I need your help," David said, his voice firm. "I need to reopen every complaint against Jason Hunt. I don't care who tried to close them. We're going to make this right." There was a pause on the other end, and David could almost hear the hesitation in her silence. Finally, Ramirez spoke, her voice low. "David, you know what you're asking for. This isn't just about Jason. There are people who won't want this to come out." David nodded, his jaw set. "I know, but this isn't just about my son anymore. It's about all the people we've let down. We can't keep protecting the ones who abuse their power." Another pause, then Ramirez sighed. "All right, I'm with you, but be careful. You're going to make enemies." David hung up, a sense of determination settling over him. He knew the risks, but he was ready to face them. For Zachary, for his family, for the community that had been failed time and time again, he would do whatever it took to bring the truth to light. The streets of the city were no longer calm. They were alive with the voices of hundreds, maybe thousands of people, men, women, and children, all demanding justice. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, their signs held high above their heads. Some read "Justice for Zachary Green," others "End Police Brutality." The chants rose like a tidal wave, crashing against the brick walls of the police station. David Green watched from the window of his office, his heart heavy. He could see the faces of the protesters, people who had grown tired of empty promises, people who had been hurt, dismissed, and overlooked. Their anger wasn't just about what happened to Zachary. It was about every injustice that had come before, every time the system had failed to protect them. David turned away from the window, his hands trembling slightly as he pressed them to the desk. He knew that what was happening outside was a direct response to the incident with Jason Hunt. But it was more than that. It was a response to years of frustration and fear, of distrust between the community and those who were supposed to serve and protect them. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. "Letitia," he answered, his voice tired. "Hey." "David," Letitia's voice came through, strained and shaky. "Where are you? You should be here. You should be with us." David closed his eyes, the words hitting him harder than he expected. I know, Tish, but I'm trying to fix this. I'm trying to do it the right way." "The right way?" Letitia's voice rose, her frustration evident. "David, look outside. People are demanding answers. They're demanding action. Your son is demanding action. And you're just sitting in that office, hiding behind paperwork and protocols." David swallowed, his throat tight. He knew she was right, but he didn't know how to explain what he was trying to do, how he was working to bring real change from the inside. "I'm not hiding, Tish. I'm fighting for him, for all of us. But I need time." "Time?" Letitia's voice broke, and David could hear the tears she was holding back. "Zach doesn't need more time. He needs to see his father stand up for him. He needs to know that you're on his side." David sighed, leaning his forehead against the cool surface of his desk. "I am on his side. I promise you that." Letitia was silent for a moment, and then she spoke, her voice softer. "Then come to the protest. Show him. Show everyone." David hesitated, his eyes drifting back to the window. The crowd was growing, their voices echoing in the afternoon air. He knew that showing his support would mean a lot to Zachary, but it would also mean openly defying the department, and that was a step he wasn't sure he was ready to take. I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice barely audible. Letitia let out a long breath. "David, we need you. I need you. Zach needs you. Just think about it, okay?" David nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I will. I promise." That evening, as the sun began to set, David found himself standing in the hallway outside Zachary's hospital room. He could hear the faint murmur of voices from inside. Letitia's gentle reassurances, Zachary's quiet responses. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Zachary looked up, his eyes tired and filled with something David could only describe as resignation. Letitia sat beside the bed, her hand resting on Zachary's arm. She glanced at David, her expression unreadable. "Hey, son," David said softly, stepping closer. He pulled up a chair and sat down, his eyes fixed on Zachary. "How are you feeling?" Zachary shrugged, his gaze shifting away. "Okay, I guess." David swallowed, the words he wanted to say catching in his throat. He glanced at Letitia, and she gave him a small nod, urging him to continue. I've been working on making things right," David said, his voice trembling slightly. "I want you to know that I'm doing everything I can to hold Jason Hunt accountable. I'm not going to let this slide." Zachary's eyes flickered to his father, a hint of bitterness in his gaze. "Yeah? And what does that even mean? More paperwork? Another investigation that goes nowhere?" David felt the sting of his son's words, but he nodded. "No, not this time. I'm going to make sure people hear about what happened to you. I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth." Zachary shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just about me, Dad. It's about everyone. Everyone that got hurt, everyone the system let down. It's not just about you fixing this for me." David reached out, his hand covering Zachary's. I know, son. And I promise you, I'm not just doing this for you. I'm doing this for all the people who've been failed by this system. I'm going to fight for them too." Zachary looked at his father, his eyes softening just a little. "Then you need to be out there. You need to show them." David's breath caught, his chest tightening. He nodded slowly, the weight of his son's words settling over him. "You're right. I need to do more." He glanced at Letitia, and she gave him a small, encouraging smile. "We'll be out there, David. We're not giving up. You shouldn't either." David squeezed Zachary's hand, his voice steady. "I won't. I promise." The next morning, David stood outside the precinct, his uniform feeling heavier than ever before. He looked out at the crowd gathered just beyond the barriers, people holding signs, chanting for justice. His heart pounded, his palms damp with sweat. He knew what he was about to do could change everything. He could lose his job, his career, everything he had worked for. But as he looked out at the faces of the people in the crowd, he knew it was worth it. It had to be. Taking a deep breath, David stepped forward, moving past the line of officers who stood between the precinct and the protesters. He walked toward the crowd, his head held high, his heart pounding. The protesters grew quiet as they noticed him approaching. David could see the surprise in their eyes, the hesitation. He stopped at the edge of the crowd, his gaze sweeping over them. "I'm Captain David Green," he said, his voice loud and clear. "And I'm here because what happened to my son, what's been happening to so many people in this community, is wrong. It's unjust and it's unacceptable." The crowd was silent, their eyes on him. David took another deep breath, his voice steadying as he continued. "I became a police officer because I wanted to protect people, to make a difference. But I've seen too many people let down by the very system that was supposed to protect them. I've seen good people hurt, ignored, and silenced. And I can't stay silent anymore." A murmur ran through the crowd, a ripple of hope and disbelief. David looked around, his eyes finding Letitia and Zachary standing near the front. Letitia's eyes were filled with tears, her hand resting on Zachary's shoulder. Zachary met his father's gaze, and for the first time in what felt like forever, David saw a glimmer of pride in his son's eyes. "I promise you," David said, his voice unwavering, "I will do everything in my power to fight for justice. Not just for my son, but for every person who's been failed by this system. We need change, and it starts here. It starts now." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising like a wave. David felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a sense of purpose filling the emptiness that had been growing inside him. He looked at his son again, and Zachary nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. David knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time he felt like he was taking a step in the right direction. And that was enough. For now, it was enough. The precinct felt different now. It wasn't just the whispers or the sidelong glances that followed David wherever he went. It was the tension in the air, the knowledge that something had shifted irreparably. David could feel it every time he stepped into the building. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable fallout of his actions. David sat at his desk, the stack of files in front of him growing by the hour. He flipped through each one, his eyes scanning the complaints that had been lodged against Jason Hunt over the years. There were so many, a relentless list of excessive force claims, racial profiling, verbal abuse, page after page of names, dates, and brief descriptions of encounters that had left people hurt, scared, and humiliated. David's heart pounded as he read, his anger building with each word. How had this gone on for so long? How had no one stopped it? Each file bore the same stamp. Closed. Each complaint was dismissed, forgotten, buried. It was more than just Jason Hunt. It was a system that had allowed him to continue, unchecked and unchallenged. He looked up as Lieutenant Ramirez entered his office, her face tense. She closed the door behind her and took a seat across from him, her eyes flickering to the files on his desk. "David," she began, her voice low, "you know this isn't going to be easy. What you're trying to do, there are people who won't let this happen without a fight." David nodded, his jaw set. "I know, but I can't let this go. Not after what happened to Zachary. Not after seeing how many people have been hurt because we didn't do our jobs." Ramirez sighed, leaning back in her chair. "It's not just Jason, you know that. There are people up the chain who've been covering for him. People who've got something to lose if this comes out. David met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. I'm not stopping, Ramirez. I'm going to bring this to the commission. I'm going to make sure every single one of these complaints is reopened. Ramirez hesitated, then nodded. All right, I'm with you, but just be careful, okay? You're stepping on some powerful toes. David gave her a small, grateful smile. Thanks, Ramirez. I appreciate it. Later that day, David walked into the chief's office, the files tucked under his arm. Chief Marlowe looked up from his desk, his expression darkening as he saw the stack of papers. What's this? Marlowe asked, his voice edged with annoyance. David placed the files on the desk, his eyes locking with the chief's. These are complaints against Officer Hunt. Complaints that were buried, ignored, or dismissed without proper investigation. Marlowe's jaw tightened, and he leaned back in his chair. David, we've been over this. Jason has his faults, but he's a good cop. He's done a lot of good work for this department. A good cop? David's voice rose, his frustration spilling over. These are people he hurt, Chief. People he used his badge to intimidate, to abuse. We can't ignore this anymore. Marlowe sighed, rubbing his temples. You're making this personal, David. I get it. What happened to your son was wrong. But this isn't just about you and Hunt. This is about the department. We can't afford the kind of scrutiny this will bring. David shook his head, his voice filled with determination. This isn't personal. This is about what's right. We can't keep protecting people like Hunt just because it's easier than facing the truth. We have to be better. Marlowe stared at him for a long moment, the silence in the room stretching between them like a chasm. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and resigned. You know what this could mean for your career, right? You could lose everything. David nodded. If that's what it takes to do the right thing, then so be it. Marlowe looked down at the files, his expression hardening. Fine. You want to take this to the commission? Go ahead. But don't expect any support from me. You're on your own. David picked up the files, his heart pounding as he turned and walked out of the office. He knew the risks, knew that this could end his career, could destroy everything he had worked for. But as he thought of Zachary, as he thought of every person who had been hurt by Hunt and the system that protected him, he knew he couldn't back down. That evening, David sat at the kitchen table, the files spread out in front of him. Letitia stood across from him, her arms crossed, her expression a mix of worry and pride. You're really going to do this? She asked, her voice soft. David nodded, his eyes meeting hers. I have to, Tish. I can't let this go, not after what happened to Zach. Letitia sighed, moving to sit beside him. She placed her hand over his, her fingers warm against his skin. I'm proud of you, you know that? But I'm scared too. This isn't just about your job. These people, they won't take this line down. David squeezed her hand, his voice gentle. I know, but I have to believe that this is worth it, that we can make things better. Letitia nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Just promise me you'll be careful. For Zach. For us. David leaned over, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I promise. The following morning, David stood before the police commission, the files in his hand. The room was cold, the air thick with tension. The commissioners sat behind a long table, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright skepticism. David took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the faces before him. He knew he was about to do something that could change everything. He knew the risks, knew the enemies he was about to make, but he also knew that this was the only way to make things right. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady. "I'm Captain David Green, and I'm here today to present evidence of systemic issues within our department. Evidence that points to a pattern of abuse and misconduct by Officer Jason Hunt, and the deliberate cover-up of these actions by certain individuals within the chain of command." A murmur ran through the room, the commissioners shifting in their seats. David continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "These complaints were filed by members of our community, people who trusted us to protect them, who believed that their voices would be heard. Instead, their complaints were ignored, dismissed, and buried. I have evidence that shows a clear pattern of abuse, and I'm asking you today to take action, to reopen these cases and hold those responsible accountable." The room fell silent, the weight of David's words hanging in the air. The lead commissioner, an older man with a stern expression, leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. "Captain Green, do you understand the implications of what you're saying?" he asked, his voice measured. "You're accusing members of your own department of covering up misconduct. That's a serious accusation." David met the commissioner's gaze, his voice unwavering. "I understand the implications, sir, but I also understand that if we don't address this, if we continue to ignore what's happening, we're failing the very people we swore to protect. We're failing our community." The commissioner was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. We'll review the evidence you've provided and determine the appropriate course of action." David exhaled, the tension in his chest easing just a little. He knew this was only the beginning, that there would be backlash, that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was making a difference, like he was doing something that mattered. As he left the commission building, David felt a sense of purpose settle over him. He knew that the fight was far from over, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had Letitia, Zachary, Ramirez, and the community behind him. And that was enough to keep him going. He stepped out into the sunlight, the warmth of the day washing over him. He looked out at the city, his city, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to hope. Hope that things could change, that they could be better. And he knew that no matter what happened next, he would keep fighting for that change. For Zachary, for his family, for everyone who had been let down by the system. David Green was no longer just a captain of the police. He was a father, a husband, and a man determined to do what was right. And he wasn't going to stop until justice was served. The protests outside the precinct had dwindled, but hadn't vanished completely. A small group remained, holding their signs and standing vigil, unwilling to let the city forget what had happened to Zachary Green. David watched them from his office window, his heart heavy, but his resolve stronger than ever. He knew the fight was far from over, but the first step had been taken. The morning was quiet, almost deceptively so, as if the precinct were holding its breath. David walked the familiar halls, his uniform still heavy with the weight of what it represented. He knew there were people in the department who supported him, who believed in what he was doing, but there were also many who saw him as a traitor, a man who had turned against his own. David entered the briefing room where the officers gathered before starting their shifts. The room went silent as he walked in, every pair of eyes turning to him. He could feel the tension, the uncertainty. He cleared his throat, standing at the front of the room, his gaze steady as he looked out at his colleagues. "Good morning," he began, his voice carrying through the room. "I wanted to take a moment to address what's been happening in our department. I know there are a lot of emotions right now. Anger, fear, confusion. But I want you all to understand something. The actions I've taken, the complaints I've brought forward, they aren't meant to tear us apart. They're meant to make us better." David paused, letting his words sink in. He could see the doubt in some of their eyes, the resentment, but there were others who looked at him with understanding, with hope. "For too long, we've let bad actors go unchecked. We've allowed misconduct to be swept under the rug, and in doing so, we've betrayed the very people we're supposed to protect. That has to stop. We can't continue to ignore the voices of our community, to ignore the people who are counting on us to be better." He looked around the room, his eyes meeting those of his fellow officers one by one. "I know this isn't easy. Change never is. But I believe in this department. I believe in all of you. And I believe that together we can build something better, something we can all be proud of." The silence stretched for a moment, and then, slowly, one of the younger officers, a woman named Patel, stood up. She nodded at David, her expression serious. "Thank you, Captain. I think a lot of us needed to hear that." David gave her a small smile, grateful for the support. He knew there would be no instant resolution, no immediate shift in attitudes. But this was a start, a step toward healing, toward rebuilding trust. Later that day, David found himself at home. The familiar comfort of his living room a welcome change from the constant tension of the precinct. Letitia was in the kitchen, the soft clatter of dishes a soothing background noise. David sat on the couch, his eyes drifting to the family photos on the wall, images of a younger Zachary, smiling and carefree. The front door opened, and Zachary stepped inside, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He paused when he saw his father, his eyes searching David's face. There was a quiet understanding between them now, something that had grown in the days since David had stepped out and joined the protest. It wasn't perfect. There was still a lot of hurt, a lot of questions, but there was also hope. "Hey, Dad," Zachary said, his voice soft. David smiled, standing up and walking over to his son. He rested a hand on Zachary's shoulder, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and love. "Hey, kiddo. How was school?" Zachary shrugged, dropping his backpack on the floor. "It was okay. A lot of people, well, they've seen the news. Some of them were weird about it." David's heart ached at the thought of his son having to deal with the aftermath of everything. He wished he could shield Zachary from it all, but he knew that wasn't possible. All he could do was be there for him. "I'm sorry, Zach," David said quietly. "I know this hasn't been easy on you. I wish I could make it all go away." Zachary shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It's okay, Dad. I know you're doing what you think is right. And I'm proud of you. I know it's not easy." David felt a lump form in his throat, and he pulled Zachary into a hug, holding his son close. "Thanks, buddy. That means a lot." Zachary hugged him back, his arms tight around his father. They stood like that for a moment, a sense of peace settling over them. For the first time in what felt like forever, David felt like things might actually be okay. The following week, the commission announced their decision. They had reviewed the evidence David had presented and found enough cause to reopen the cases against Jason Hunt. The announcement sent ripples through the department, through the entire city. Jason was placed on unpaid leave, pending the outcome of a formal investigation. It wasn't everything David wanted, but it was a start. David stood in the kitchen with Letitia, watching the news as the announcement was made. Letitia turned to him, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions: hope, fear, pride. "You did it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. David shook his head, his gaze still on the television screen. "It's not over yet, but it's a step in the right direction." Letitia moved closer, wrapping her arms around him. "I'm proud of you, David. I know this hasn't been easy, but you did what you had to do. For Zach. For all of us." David leaned his forehead against hers, his eyes closing as he let out a shaky breath. "I just want to make things better, Tish. I want to make sure Zach grows up in a world where he doesn't have to be afraid of people like Jason Hunt." Letitia nodded, her voice gentle. "And that's exactly what you're doing, one step at a time." The days that followed were filled with both hope and uncertainty. The protests had quieted, the crowd outside the precinct dwindling as people waited to see what would happen next. David knew that the fight wasn't over, that there were still battles to be fought, but for the first time he felt like they were moving in the right direction. He met with Ramirez and a few other officers who had supported him, discussing changes that needed to be made within the department, new training programs, new protocols for handling complaints. It was a long list, and David knew it would take time, but he was determined to see it through. There were still those in the department who resented him, who saw him as a traitor, but David had come to terms with that. He knew he couldn't change everyone's mind, but he also knew that change had to start somewhere. And if that meant losing the support of some of his colleagues, then so be it. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, David, Letitia, and Zachary sat on the back porch, the cool breeze rustling the leaves of the trees in their yard. It was a rare moment of calm, a chance to just be together as a family. Zachary looked at his father, his eyes thoughtful. "Do you think things are really going to change, Dad?" he asked, his voice soft. David looked at his son, his heart swelling with both love and determination. He reached over, ruffling Zachary's hair. "I think it's going to take a lot of work, kiddo, but I think it can change, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure it does." Zachary nodded, a small smile on his lips. "Good, because I want to help too." David's eyes widened slightly, a sense of pride washing over him. "You do?" "Yeah," Zachary said, his voice gaining confidence. "I mean, I don't know how yet, but I want to. I want to make things better too." David smiled, his heart feeling lighter than it had in weeks. He reached over, pulling Zachary into a hug. "You already are, Zach, just by being you." Letitia watched them, her eyes filled with love. She reached over, placing her hand on David's arm. "We're all in this together," she said softly, "and that's what makes the difference." David nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon, the last rays of sunlight painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He knew that the road ahead would be long, that there would be setbacks and challenges, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had his family, his community, and a determination that nothing could shake. As they sat there, the sky growing darker above them, David felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of hope. Hope that things could change, that they could be better. And he knew that, no matter what, he would keep fighting for that change. For Zachary, for Letitia, for every person who had ever been let down by the system. David Green had found his purpose, and he wasn't going to stop until justice was served. Sunlight filtered gently through the curtains in David's office. He sat at his desk, his eyes scanning the documents spread before him. Papers containing the new protocols for the department lay scattered. These were the beginnings of the reforms he had long dreamed of. Now that the situation with Jason had been publicly exposed and the investigation was underway, David knew that the real work was just beginning. The door to his office creaked open, and Lieutenant Ramirez peeked inside. She smiled as she saw him, still immersed in his work. "I thought you'd be home by now," she said, leaning against the doorframe. David looked up and sighed, returning her smile with a tired one of his own. "I know. I promised Letitia I'd be back early tonight." Ramirez stepped inside, her tone softening. "You've done a lot, David. More than most would have dared. But you need to remember that you can't do it all in one day." David nodded, knowing she was right. He leaned back in his chair, taking in the sight of the documents that represented so much of what he hoped to achieve. "It's just, I don't want to lose momentum. If we let up now, it all might slip away." Ramirez crossed the room and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It won't. You've inspired a lot of people here, David. Change is happening because of you, and that change isn't going anywhere as long as we keep pushing." David met her eyes, gratitude welling up inside him. "Thanks, Ramirez. I couldn't have done this without your support." She gave him a gentle pat on the back. "We're all in this together, Captain. Now go home. Your family needs you too." David smiled, nodding. "Yeah, you're right. They do." When David arrived home, the living room was filled with the comforting smells of Letitia's cooking, and soft music played in the background. Letitia was standing by the stove, stirring a pot, while Zachary sat at the kitchen table, sketching something in his notebook. "Dad!" Zachary exclaimed when he saw David enter, a smile breaking across his face. He set his pencil down and stood up, coming over to give his father a hug. David returned the hug warmly, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "How was school today?" Zachary shrugged, but there was a small smile on his lips. "Better. A couple of people even said they thought what you did was cool. Standing up for what's right and all." David's chest tightened at his son's words, pride swelling inside him. "I'm glad to hear that, Zach. It means a lot to know that people see why this matters." Letitia turned from the stove, her eyes softening as she watched her husband and son together. "You're just in time for dinner," she said, her smile warm. "I made your favorite." David stepped over to her, leaning in to give her a quick kiss on the cheek. "Thanks, Tish. I could really use a good meal right now." She smiled at him, her eyes meeting his, and he could see the unspoken support there, the understanding, the partnership that they had always shared, even through the hardest of times. After dinner, they all sat in the living room together, the weight of the past weeks finally beginning to ease. David watched as Zachary showed his mother some of his sketches, his eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. The boy's resilience was remarkable, and David felt a deep sense of gratitude that, despite everything, they were all here, together. Letitia glanced at David, her voice soft when she spoke. "I heard about the new training program you're planning for the department. Sounds like it could really make a difference." David nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "I hope so. It's a start, but there's still a lot to be done. It's not just about policy. It's about changing the way we think, the way we see each other. That's the real challenge." Zachary looked up, curiosity in his eyes. "Do you think it'll really work, Dad? Do you think people can actually change?" David paused, considering his son's question. He leaned forward, meeting Zachary's gaze. "I think change is always possible, but it takes work, It takes people willing to step up and make a difference, even when it's hard. And sometimes it takes seeing things differently, like how I finally saw what needed to be done. Zachary nodded, his expression serious. I want to help too. Maybe one day I could do something to make things better. David smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He reached over, placing a hand on Zachary's shoulder. You already are, son. Just by being who you are, by believing in something better, you're helping. Letitia reached over, taking David's hand in hers. We're all helping in our own way, and as long as we keep doing that, things can get better. They sat there together, the warmth of their home wrapping around them like a protective blanket. David knew there were still challenges ahead, still so much work to be done. But for now, in this moment, he allowed himself to feel hope. Hope for the future, for his family, for the community that had stood by them. The sky outside had darkened, and the first stars began to twinkle above. David looked out the window, a sense of peace washing over him. They had faced the worst and come out stronger, and as long as they stayed together, he knew they could face whatever came next. No matter how hard the fight, David Green knew one thing for certain. They would keep fighting for justice, for fairness, for the right of every person to be seen and heard. And that, in the end, made all the difference. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss our next video. Feel free to explore our other videos for more stories like this one. And if you think someone else would appreciate this message, share it with them.